Well, my dear sons and daughters, today our lecture would be Mathew Arnold, a famous Victorian critic, and his book, The Essays in Criticism. Name of the book is The Essays in Criticism, and in that book, which was published in 1865, he has included a wonderful critical essay called The Function of Criticism in Present Time. The function of criticism in present time. It means, from the very outset, let me make it clear to all of you that since Mathew Arnold is a Victorian critic, that is why he has written the topic, he has given the name to his critical essay as the function of criticism in present time. It means this function of criticism may not be relevant to 21st century, because as you know that every era in the annals of history, every age in the annals of history has its own trends, literary trends, social trends, moral trends, and these trends vary from the trends of the other age, right? So you are required to take this function of criticism in the present time, means in the time of the Victorian age. This function of criticism, as he described it, and we will be exploring it later on in our lecture, is not meant for today in 2024. Maybe it is not for today. It is for the Victorian era, the richest era in English literature, because you have gone through the Victorian novels, you have read some Victorian poets as well, right? So what was the function of criticism in Victorian age? First of all, you must take it into mind that this function of criticism is the function of criticism in present time. In present time means in the time when Mathew Arnold lived, and as you know, this article, this critical essay was published in 1864, right? In 1864, in the mid of the Victorian age. Later on, Mathew Arnold included this essay in his famous book of essays, The Essays in Criticism. Since then, this essay is very famous in the entire field of criticism. Not that it is unimportant today. It is still relevant and important, because according to T.S. Eliot, we cannot lose touch with the traditions. So far as criticism is concerned, we read Aristotle, we read Philip Sidney, we read Wordsworth, and then Mathew Arnold and T.S. Eliot. All these critics don't belong to 21st century, still their critical ideas are not only very important for the students of literature to learn, but to some extent they are still very relevant. Even Biographia Literaria, written by Coleridge in 18th century, Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads was written before this function of criticism or essays in criticism by Mathew Arnold. Aristotle's The Poetics was written even before the birth of Christ. Still it is very relevant, and no study of tragedy and no discussion of tragedy is complete without without reference to Aristotle's definition of tragedy. So, say around 25 or 2600 years ago, Aristotle discussed tragedy and plot and the function of tragedy and the components of tragedy. Even today, they are very relevant. So, the function of criticism at the present time refers to the Victorian age, 19th century, but still it will help you a lot to understand and interpret various genres of English literature without having a link with the tradition. You cannot exercise your individual talent, says T.S. Eliot. Right? So on this ground, it is very relevant even today. That was the first thing. And Mathew Arnold has in his mind the Victorian society, and you know, after the Industrial Revolution in 1832, Industrial Revolution took place in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, in the era of Queen Victoria, right? And we call it Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution has its own impact on British society. Every revolution and every big incident certainly has its influence on any society where it takes place. I recall 9/11, which took place in 2001, and this 9/11 was a global incident, and it has a lot of war impact on the world. Perhaps you were little kids those days, but we, the elders, have seen that its impact is still alive even in 2024. Likewise, Renaissance was not a domestic incident of Italy. It encompassed the entire Europe, and it has exercised an everlasting impact on poetry, on literature, on morality, on society, on everything. French Revolution has revolutionized the entire Europe. Likewise, this Industrial Revolution, which actually started by the passing of the Bill of Industrial Reforms in 1832 in British Parliament, had a deep impact on the socio-political life, economic life, moral life of the British society. So, Mathew Arnold has in his mind to counter the moral anarchy, the moral changes that took place in Victorian society as a result of industrial revolution that changed England from an agrarian society to industrialization, to industrial society, right? When the society is agrarian in nature, and then gradually it changes from agrarian society to industrial society, the society becomes machine. The society or the individuals living in society act like the gadgets, like the machines, and their culture, social culture, and their economic culture, and their moral fabric and culture gets greatly disturbed. So it was the primary aim of Mathew Arnold through this essay, The Function of Criticism, at the present time. He wants to reform the Victorian society and wants to establish the importance of art and literature as they were in Renaissance period. Since my focus is on this particular essay and not tracing the history of the Victorian era, just one sentence that the morality of the Victorian time has totally changed from that of the Renaissance England. In Victorian era, the morality got so strict that they even removed certain dialogues and certain passages whom they regard immoral from the works of Shakespeare, and because they read Shakespearean plays in their own homes before their family members, so they regarded certain passages of Shakespearean plays as immoral as per their own morality. So that is why Mathew Arnold thinks that this type of limited Victorian morality and restricted Victorian morality is not fit for the production of art and pure literature. So he came up with this essay, The Function of Criticism, which was originally published in 1864, and later on it was included in his famous book, The Essays in Criticism. This book, The Essays in Criticism, was published 1 year after that, 1865. And for your interest, let me tell you that Mathew Arnold was a professor of poetry in the world famous Oxford University. During one of his lectures on the translation of Homer, he said that the literature of France and say Germany and even England and the entire Europe started from critical faculty, not from the creative faculty. This sentence he spoke in his famous lecture given on poetry, since he was the professor of poetry in Oxford University. Now this statement or this single sentence created a lot of controversy, a heated controversy among the intelligentsia of British society, and they started disagreeing with Mathew Arnold that he has given more importance to critical faculty than creative faculty. In order to understand this essay properly, you will have to understand criticism and creativity first. Then I will go ahead. Creativity means if you write a poem with the help of your imagination by arranging the words in a proper sequence, this poem would be called creativity. If you write a novel by the help of various fictitious events and characters, it would be called creativity. If you write a short story or a drama likewise, it would be called a creative effort. It would be called a creativity, pure creativity. But if you translate Homer, or if you translate, say, Sheikh Sadi, who wrote parables in Persian, if you translate it in Urdu or English, for those readers who can't understand Persian, it would be called criticism or critical faculty. It means the writer who has translated Homer or Virgil or Tasso or Ariosto and other Latin and Greek writers, Sophocles, his Oedipus Rex, this too is a translated version. It would be translating from a non-English writer or translating a writer of different language to your native language or to your national language is called critical faculty. It would be not a creativity on your part, means you have not exercised a creative effort. You have simply used your translating ability, since you are the master of both the languages. And this translation is very much in vogue these days here in Pakistan, because I have come to know so many English novels are being translated in Urdu in order to enable those people who can understand only Urdu and they are unable to understand English to acquaint them with biggest English masters. During the Corona days, I have come across a novel which I have already read in English, though it was translated in English. Love in the Time of Cholera, and it was translated Love in the Time of Cholera was a novel of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and his another famous novel is 100 Years of Solitude. These two novels are in fact translation, because Garcia writes in some other language. So they are translated into English and then they are retranslated or further translated into Urdu, and that was called Waba Ke Dino Ki Mohabbat, right? People used to read that novel during the Corona pandemic, when everybody was on leave and at home and in quarantine, and they were reading. Now the critical faculty is in vogue even today. So you must keep in mind that Mathew Arnold, in translating in his lectures, translating Homer, keep in mind this lecture, translating Homer. Homer was a great poet. He he delivered a lecture translating Homer, and he said that all the Europe, and that is a fact, that all the Europe started literature from translation. If you think of the days of Chaucer, before Chaucer, people used to translate the poetry, Italian poetry and French poetry into English. Chaucer used to do the same. From critical effort, Chaucer came to creative work. This was the point which Mathew Arnold stated in one of his lectures as the professor of poetry at Oxford University. And people said that he has overemphasized the importance of criticism. He has given more importance to critical faculty than the creative faculty. And before him, Wordsworth, the great romantic poet, in a letter, he has given his own point of view. Everybody has his own opinion, and you are free to have your own opinion. Opinions different from person to person. As I keep saying that one brother is different from another brother. One professor is different from another professor. That is the law of nature. So Wordsworth in his letter, and by the way, let me tell you that Wordsworth died in April 1850. So, say 14 years before the publication of this essay, Wordsworth in his letter exclaimed that the creative faculty, even of a lower kind, is better than the critical faculty of the highest level. You get this point? This is Wordsworth's opinion, that, I repeat, that the creative faculty, even of a lower level, is better than the critical faculty of a higher rank. Now, Mathew Arnold disagreed with this statement of Wordsworth by citing certain examples even from Wordsworth's own works, and he gave response to Wordsworth by saying that there are Wordsworth's series of poems which is called ecclesiastical sonnets, and they were not hailed in society among the general reading public and the critics as Wordsworth's masterpiece. They were not regarded, the ecclesiastical sonnets written by William Wordsworth, Mathew Arnold says, were not hailed as masterpiece among the general reading public and the critics alike, as compared to his critical treatise, his critical document, which is called Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Right? He has given the example from Wordsworth's own works to prove that it is quite right that creativity is certainly better than the criticism, or creative faculty is better than the critical effort. But this is not, say, a logical statement that creativity even of a lower level is better than the, say, critical activity of a higher level. And he gave examples from Wordsworth's own works. That Wordsworth ecclesiastical sonnets, Wordsworth is a very prolific writer. He has written a lot of poems, but he cited the example of one series of poems that is called ecclesiastical sonnets. Ecclesiastical sonnets are much inferior to Wordsworth's critical document, Preface to Lyrical Ballad, in which Wordsworth explained that his theory of poetry, his definition of poetry, his diction of poetry, that how the diction of poetry should be there. He has written, excuse me, he has given so many examples from the Preface to Lyrical Ballads by saying that Wordsworth stated that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. He said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. This critical document is certainly better than Wordsworth's creative series of poems, ecclesiastical sonnets. Then he cited another example from Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is the bigger name of the 18th century literature. Dr. Samuel Johnson was the biggest literary giant of the 18th century. And he has cited his new classical drama called Irene. Dr. Johnson, having written Irene, himself declared it as the most inferior work he has ever produced. He himself admitted that this is the most inferior creative work ever produced by a man like Dr. Johnson. Everybody is a human being. Sometimes you are in a great form and sometimes you are not in a form. Sometimes your best players like Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo or say like Kohli and Babar Azam, they score hundreds and sometimes they got out quite cheaply. Sometimes Messi can score 2-3 goals and sometimes the day is not for Messi. So on a bad day he cannot perform. So that particular work, Irene, written by a literary giant like Dr. Samuel Johnson, was totally flop, and he himself admitted, as well as the critics and the general reading public regarded it as a flop show. But his critical book, Mathew Arnold referred, his critical book, commonly called The Lives of Poets, which I believe is present in our library. I took it from library once many years ago and read it. The actual name of that book is 52, The Lives of 52 Prominent English Poets, which includes Milton and Wordsworth and many others. So, he gives this example from Wordsworth and Dr. Johnson, that Wordsworth is not right when he says that creative work, even of a lower degree, is better than the critical work of a higher degree. He gives the example that lives of the 52 prominent English poets, which is commonly called Lives of Poets, is a critical document, is a critical book, and it is much superior to the creative neoclassical tragedy Irene, written by Dr. Samuel Johnson. However, he left this topic here because he regards it as a wastage of time, simply that whether the critical faculty is better or the creative faculty is better, and he directly came to the function of criticism, that what is the function of criticism, and function of criticism in the at the present time, right? But generally we call it a function of criticism. Function of criticism is very important to know, because majority of the people regard criticism as something lower than creativity. Mathew Arnold proves that there are certain ages, there are certain eras when the work of creativity is not possible for the creative writers. It is the duty then of a critic to create those ideas, those current for the poets and the novelists and different writers. And I can cite several examples on this thing, that when Aristotle wrote the Poetics in response to Plato's the Republic, in which Plato banned poetry, the influence of Plato was so bigger on the intellectuals that if Aristotle did not come up with his defense of poetry with his defense of poetry, without which today we would not have come across such big poets, even of today, like even of later 20th century like Seamus Heaney, or earlier 20th century like T.S. Eliot, because poetry would have been banned, because the influence of Plato was so big on the intellectual or intelligentsia of that society. So it was due to the critical effort of Aristotle in the Poetics that he saved poetry as the benefactor of literature. And as I said earlier, that poetry is the oldest branch of literature. Had there been no Aristotle, and had there been no critical effort like the Poetics, today there would have been no poetry at all, neither English poetry nor Urdu poetry, because people would have turned against poetry. People would have stopped writing poetry under the towering influence of Plato. So the function of criticism, according to Mathew Arnold, is to produce a current, to produce newer ideas, to produce a milieu and an environment, creative environment and creative atmosphere for the novelist, for the dramatist, for the poets to work on these currents and these ideas. Certain ages, for example, in Renaissance period or in Shakespearean days, things were not in proper shape for novel writing, whereas in 17th century the novel took a start, but it was not called a proper novel. Later on in the 18th century, The situation was, or the environment or atmosphere for novel writing was there. That is why novel started, and it started quite late, later than the drama. This shows that the ideas, critical ideas, paved the way for the production and development of literature. That's why he has discussed the function of criticism and tried to convince people that without criticism, not only the production of literature is, say, impossible, but the proper understanding of literature is impossible. So since this essay is a long one, so tomorrow I'll come with the educative purpose of criticism and the disinterestedness of criticism. So today the lecture ends here. Why he has written the function of criticism. Mathew Arnold has written the function of criticism at the present time.